Let's have a discussion about the events of the week with our regulars on Friday, Catherine McGregor in Canberra and Nicholas Reece in Melbourne. Let's start with you, Nicholas. You must be absolutely pleased, pumped, smile all across your face that Peter Dutton and the Australian Border Force have been given the all-clear in this investigation into Ruby Princess, despite a concerted last-quarter push by the ABC to try and frame them.
Oh, Chris, I'm not going to engage in partisan politics for something as serious as this. And it is a very serious report that Bret Walker SC has brought down today. It is absolutely damning. Talks about a string of errors being made, but does single out New South Wales Health for
absolutely, as always seemed the case. They've made a series of errors here, and we've seen this play out through the inquiry. It's the expert panel that's made these errors. Surely it's the Health Minister, as it's always looked, Brad Hazzard, who's in the frame. And do you think he can survive this?
Well, the Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, this afternoon was saying that she was going to review the report carefully over the weekend. So that gives her the weekend to weigh up options, I guess, around her Health Minister and for her government. I mean, it is a very damning report. I haven't made my way fully through the 315-odd pages of it. So I'd like to reserve my judgment about Mr Hazzard's future. But what I know of it, talking about inexplicable errors, just basic things like isolation, testing of people. We shouldn't forget there was 630-odd cases that came as a result of this and almost 30 deaths. So someone's got to pay a price, you would have thought, for such bungling on such scale.
Yeah, Catherine, the point here is there's an outbreak on the ship and people were going to get sick. That tragedy can't be stopped. But the problem here was how it was managed and then allowed to spread around the country and even outside the country. And I don't think there's anything in this report. Likewise, we haven't had time to go through every detail. But this is exactly what we expected. We've seen this come out inexplicably. While they were still waiting for COVID-19 test results, they let people off the ship. And that's the basic failing right there. And that's the one that Brad Hazzard's always tried to defend. And that's the one, surely, that's going to bring him undone, because someone has to pay a price. Someone has to be accountable for this sort of ridiculous error.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely correct. And the staggering thing about this crisis from the outset has been that, unlike all the other major crises that Australia has been through, and we're going to mark the end of the Pacific War 75 years ago tomorrow, the states have run their own race with impunity on things as diverse as border closures, executive fiat with parliaments not sitting, and no accountability. Now, I suspect Gladys Berejiklian will dispense with this minister. I think she's thoroughly entitled to. And it's interesting to hear Nick demanding heads when I presume he's got his #iGrandstand with Dan running on Twitter furiously down there, and the Victorian Parliament's not sitting and no one's been called to account for the failures in that state. And if you're going to be brutal about it, any failings in terms of the Ruby Princess are absolutely in the shade by comparison with the staggering toll, the relative staggering toll in Victoria.
I'll come to that in just a moment.
Both states have failed badly.
I want to come to that in a moment, but I just want to get back to this point that Nicholas didn't want to engage in on the first place, and that is there's been a concerted political attempt by Christina Keneally and journalists, especially at the ABC, to try and pin this disaster on the federal government, on Peter Dutton, on Australian Border Force. And the inquiry, to quote directly, it says it was interesting journalism that tried to do this, but the facts don't stack up, that it is not correct. And they've given the Australian Border Force and the federal government, therefore, a clear bill of health on this issue, on the Ruby Princess. But when we look to Victoria, Nicholas, we've had a pretty quick report here. The New South Wales government's just thrown it out there. Everyone can read it now. When are we going to get that sort of transparency in Victoria? The the consequences have been far more disastrous. The evidence of government stuff-ups are far more extensive when it comes to quarantine and tracing and not keeping infected people at home and all the rest of it. Yet Daniel Andrews has just kicked out the inquiry till November. There doesn't seem to be any accountability being delivered in your home state.
Well, that's not true at all, Chris. I mean, I was able to make the pronouncements I was about the New South Wales government because there's now been an independent inquiry by a very eminent SC. In Victoria, we haven't yet completed that investigation, but the process is underway with Justice Coate, very eminent member of the Victorian judiciary.
And even that's been delayed.
Into this. And look, it has been delayed, but it was scheduled to report in September. It will now be November. In the scheme of things, that is not a huge delay. And there will be, there is a very, very thorough investigation underway, and we will get to the bottom of this. Victorians are very angry about what has happened, and I am sure there will be consequences. I know there will be consequences at the end of that investigation, as there should be in New South Wales, which I hope the New South Wales Premier is pondering over the weekend.
Now, Catherine, you did mention it earlier. I shared some recollections at the top of the program from some radio listeners on Ben Fordham's program. I want to get your thoughts on the significance of tomorrow, victory in the Pacific, the end of the Second World War for Australia, 75 years ago tomorrow. So important because so many of the people who lived through that are still alive, and it's so important that we show our gratitude and what all their sacrifices have delivered for us all these years later.
Well, there's about 12,000 World War II veterans still alive, and the oldest of those, Alf Carpenter's, spoken to the Australian for tomorrow, and he's in terrific nick and wonderful, wonderful legacy that he's looked back on. And in the same week that Teddy Sheen was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, it is appropriate to reflect on what an extraordinary generation that was, having lived through the Depression, then a war that directly touched Australia. It's too easy in this day and age to forget there was an attack on Sydney Harbour. Darwin and Broome were bombed multiple times, as was Katherine. So an amazing feat by Australians. And I just close with the relevant point for today. Our parliaments sat through that period. Our high courts deliberated on matters in that period. There was no executive fiat that suspended the operation of democratic norms. There were some harsh measures implemented, certainly under national security legislation, but it was a functioning democracy where politicians faced up in Parliament as they are paid to do. Yeah,
I agree, and I think that's relevant today as well. Just quickly, Nick, your thoughts as well. We talk about the 12,000 veterans, and they, of course, are of a special level of gratitude owed to them, but I think it's great that we can still talk to people like my parents who were children at that time. They remember the hardship, and they remember, above anything, that relief that we commemorate 75 years ago tomorrow.
Absolutely, Chris. So one of my proudest possessions actually is a letter I've got framed here on the wall at home, which was sent by a family member to my grandma, and this family member was actually on the USS Missouri on the 2nd of September when Emperor Hirohito in Tokyo Bay signed the surrender and ended the war in the Pacific. And I can tell you I'm going to be taking that down over the weekend and yet again telling my kids that story about how the war touched our country, affected our family, and how we were there, or our family was there on the very last day. It was such a momentous event for Australia, and of course it's something that still affects our nation today. Our whole alliance with the United States, of course, came about out of that Pacific War, and with the end of the war, the wave of migration that came to Australia afterwards changed our nation profoundly. So in terms of events that have shaped this nation, it's hard to think of one that's more significant than that.
Thanks for joining us, Nicholas and Catherine. Have a great weekend.
You too. Thanks, Chris.